If you had been a Red Army soldier standing on the approaches to Königsberg in early April 1945, the first thing that worried you probably would not have been the burning buildings in the distance. It would have been everything standing between you and them. Königsberg was not simply a city with a few guns and hastily built barricades across its streets. It was a city surrounded by a defensive tradition that had been built over generations. On the approaches stood old brick and earth forts, constructed in an earlier century, with thick walls, deep ditches, protected firing positions, and carefully chosen fields of fire designed to force attackers into exposed ground. By 1945, these forts were no longer the most modern fortifications in Europe. But calling them useless would be a serious mistake. The Germans had incorporated many of these older positions into a much broader defensive system of trenches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, machine gun positions, artillery, and prepared strongpoints inside the city itself. That meant a Soviet infantryman who crossed one defensive ditch had not necessarily broken through the defense. Ahead of him might be a machine gun nest. Behind that might be a row of solid brick buildings. Beyond those buildings could be another anti-tank position. And even an old fort that had been partly isolated could still dominate road, open ground, bridges, or approaches that Soviet troops needed to use. Urban warfare added another layer of difficulty. A basement could become a shelter. A broken wall could become cover. A railway embankment could become a defensive line. An intersection could become a killing zone. And the defenders possessed something that never appears clearly on a military map. They knew the ground. They knew which streets connected to one another. They knew the best observation points. They knew the bridges, rail lines, alleys, courtyards, and routes through damaged neighborhood. The hackers had to discover those things while moving forward under fire. This was exactly the kind of place that was supposed to consume time. And in the final months of the war, time still mattered. Berlin lay far to the west. German forces elsewhere in East Prussia were still struggling to preserve routes toward the Baltic coast. Every additional day Königsberg remained in German hands forced the Red Army to keep artillery, engineers, tanks, assault guns, and infantry committed to this battlefield. That was one of the oldest purposes of a fortress. It did not always have to defeat the attacking army. Sometimes it only had to make the enemy pay in time. And from the outside, Königsberg appeared to possess nearly everything required to do exactly that. Fort, prepared defensive, ruined street, tens of thousands of defenders in the wider fortress area, and terrain that naturally favored men who were waiting rather than men who had to advance. Looking at those defenses before the final assault, there was little reason to assume this would be a short battle. And that is where the central contradiction of Königsberg begins. Because the strength of a fortress does not come only from the thickness of its walls. It comes from whether those walls, strongpoints, roads, reserves, guns, and soldiers can still function as one system. A fort can remain standing. A machine gun can still fire. A battalion can still resist. But if supplies can no longer move freely, communications begin to fail, reserves cannot reach the threatened sectors, and neighboring positions lose the ability to support one another, then an impressive defensive network can begin to break apart far faster than its concrete and brick would suggest. And before the Red Army truly began breaking through the walls of Königsberg, a crucial part of the trap had already been taking shape outside them. The strength of Königsberg did not end with its walls, its forts, or the guns positioned around the city. A fortress is truly dangerous only as long as it remains connected to a larger battlefield. It needs supply routes. It needs a way to move wounded men out. It needs roads that can bring reserves in. And, perhaps most importantly, it needs somewhere to go if the situation becomes impossible to hold. By early 1945, all of those things were becoming increasingly uncertain at Königsberg. The Red Army's advance into East Prussia had done more than push the front closer to the city. It had done something far more dangerous. It had reduced the amount of space the Germans could use. Road after road came under threat. The gaps between German-held areas became narrower, and Königsberg, instead of remaining a fortress behind a broad defensive front, was gradually becoming an isolated position surrounded by Soviet forces advancing from several directions. One direction still mattered more than the others: west. The route from Königsberg toward the Samman Peninsula and farther toward the port of Pillau was not simply another road on a military map. It was a lifeline. Along that route, men and supplies could still move. Through that direction, at least in theory, the garrison could remain connected with German forces still fighting outside the city. And if everything went wrong, the west also offered the most obvious direction for any attempt to escape. That created a problem no fortress wall could solve. The more firmly the German command insisted that Königsberg had to be held, the more important those external routes became. A bunker could survive artillery fire. A fort could withstand repeated attacks. But no wall could manufacture fuel when stocks began to run low. No anti-tank ditch could replace a supply column that could no longer reach the city. And no machine gun could reopen a road that the enemy had cut somewhere beyond its field of fire. That is why the battle around Königsberg mattered just as much as the defenses inside it. On a map, the distance toward Samman might appear small. But in war, a short distance does not mean a safe route. If the enemy can place artillery fire across that road, capture a key junction, or move infantry into positions overlooking the corridor, then a supply line can quickly become a dangerous race through exposed ground. And every time that corridor becomes narrower, the choices available to the defenders become narrower with it. This was the point at which Königsberg began to change its character. It was still a fortress, but it was also beginning to become a trap. That did not mean the German troops inside the city had suddenly lost the ability to fight. They still had weapons. They still occupied strong defensive positions. They could still inflict serious casualties on any foes attempting a direct assault. And that was precisely what made the situation so deceptive. A formation that can still fight can easily believe that it can still change the outcome. Those are not the same thing. You may still hold a fort. You may still control a street. You may even throw back a local attack. But if the larger battlefield around you is steadily passing into enemy hand, each small success may do little more than purchase another day inside a tightening ring. That was the dilemma facing the defenders of Königsberg. Withdraw too early, and Germany would surrender the historic capital of East Prussia along with a formidable defensive position. Wait too long, and the fortifications built to protect the garrison could help keep it trapped in a place from which there was no longer a realistic escape. At that point, the most important question was no longer whether Königsberg possessed strong walls. The question was whether the men behind those walls still had enough operational freedom to make that strength matter. As the Red Army prepared for the final assault, the answer was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for the defenders. But isolation alone could not capture Königsberg. The forts were still there. The trenches were still there. The guns were still there. To enter the city, the Red Army still had to solve a much harder problem. How do you turn one enormous defensive system into a collection of positions that can no longer support one another? And the answer begins with understanding that the old forts surrounding Königsberg were never the whole defense. When you look at a map of Königsberg, it is easy to focus on the large forts surrounding the city. They are the most dramatic features. Thick brick walls, deep defensive ditches, protected firing positions, structures that had existed long before the Second World War began. And their age can lead to an obvious conclusion. If many of these forts had been designed in the previous century, perhaps by 1945 they were simply obsolete. Perhaps that explains why Königsberg fell so quick. But that explanation misses what made the defense dangerous. The old forts did not need to be invulnerable in order to remain useful. They only had to force an attacking force to stop, change direction, bring heavier weapons forward, or wait while engineers found a way through. A defensive position that survived for only a few additional hours could delay everything moving behind the first assault troops. A gun protected inside a strong position could dominate a road that Soviet armor needed to use. A deep ditch might not stop an attack forever, but it could separate infantry from tanks at exactly the moment when each needed the other most. That was the real value of many of Königsberg's older fortifications. And more importantly, the forts were not fighting alone. By the final months of the war, the defense of Königsberg included much more than the masonry structures that appeared so clearly on maps. Field fortifications had been added around them. Trenches connected defensive areas. Minefields covered likely approaches. Anti-tank obstacles forced vehicles to slow down or move toward predictable routes. Machine gun positions covered gaps between larger strongpoints. Anti-tank guns could wait behind those obstacles for Soviet vehicles to appear where the defenders expected them. And once the attackers reached the built-up areas, they faced an entirely different kind of defensive terrain. Residential blocks, railway facilities, industrial building, brick houses, basement, courtyard, collapsed walls. In a city already damaged by war, destruction itself could become part of the defense. A building did not need a roof to become a strongpoint. A wall did not need to be intact to conceal a machine gun. A street filled with rubble could prevent a tank from maneuvering freely and force it onto exactly the route a German anti-tank crew was watching. This meant the Red Army was not confronting one neat ring of forts that could simply be broken and left behind. The Soviet troops were facing layers of resistance. If one fort was bypassed, defenders in trenches farther back could continue fighting. If those trenches were taken, buildings inside the suburbs could become the next defensive line. If one street was captured, Soviet troops might still receive fire from neighboring blocks or strongpoints that had not yet been neutralized. That is why it is misleading to dismiss the Königsberg forts as nothing more than outdated relics. Yes, many had been designed for a different age of warfare. They had not been built with every weapon of 1945 in mind. Heavy artillery, direct fire guns, aerial bombardment, demolition charges, and modern combat engineers could defeat positions that their original designers had never expected to face. But being vulnerable was not the same as being useless. A fort did not have to survive untouched. It only had to make the attack slow, more complicated, and more expensive. And when several defensive positions could support one another, the problem became much harder. That was the real strength of Königsberg. Not one wall, not one fort, but the combination of older permanent fortifications, newer field defenses, urban terrain, obstacles, weapons, and troops capable of continuing the fight from one position after another. On paper, this was exactly the kind of defensive system that should force an attacking army to advance step by step. So when Königsberg collapsed rapidly during that final assault, the answer could not simply be that its forts were too old. The Red Army still had to deal with them. But the Soviets did not necessarily need to destroy every fort, capture every building, and eliminate every German position before the defense could begin to fail. There was another way. A way to turn one enormous defensive problem into a series of smaller ones, and then attack each of those problems with a very deliberate combination of artillery, armor, engineers, and assault infantry. That was when the Red Army began to change the nature of the battle itself. If Königsberg really was a defensive system made up of forts, trenches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and city blocks that could be turned into strongpoints, then perhaps the worst way to attack it was to treat all of those defenses as one enormous wall. An enormous wall suggests an enormous solution. More artillery, more bombs, more men. And the Red Army certainly possessed the ability to concentrate firepower on a scale that the defenders of Königsberg could not easily match. Before the final assault, Soviet artillery was massed heavily along selected breakthrough sectors. Heavy guns could attack fortification. Direct fire weapons could engage in barrages, fortified building, and machine gun positions. Mortars could cover the ground infantry had to cross. Tanks and self-propelled guns could bring powerful weapons closer to the front. Overhead, Soviet aircraft added further pressure against defensive position, communication, and troop concentrations. But if firepower alone explained Königsberg, this would be a much simpler story. Artillery could break a wall. It could collapse part of a building. It could silence a machine gun for a time. But artillery could not walk into a basement and determine whether the defenders were still there. It could not clear every mine. It could not discover every anti-tank gun hidden beyond the next intersection. And it could not hold a position once the smoke lifted. For those tasks, the Red Army needed forces that were smaller, more flexible, and organized for the particular battlefield Königsberg presented. That was where assault groups became so important. Instead of sending infantry forward alone and waiting for help once it encountered resistance, attacking forces could combine infantry with engineers, machine guns, mortars, direct fire, artillery, tanks, or self-propelled guns according to the problem in front of them. Each element solved a different part of the problem. Infantry located and occupied positions. Combat engineers opened paths through mines, wire, and obstacles. If an entrance was blocked, explosives could create another one. If a firing position was too dangerous to approach from the front, troops could work around its flank or attempt to reach the rear. Tanks and self-propelled guns delivered direct fire against positions that rifles and machine guns could not easily defeat. Artillery could suppress areas behind the immediate objective and make it more difficult for German reinforcements to move forward. And the infantry had to remain close enough to take advantage of the brief moments when the defenders were forced down by that fire. The important point is that there was no single secret weapon. No one gun solved Königsberg. No individual tank suddenly made the fortifications meaningless. The effectiveness came from combining different tools against the same tactical problem. Imagine a German machine gun position controlling a street. If Soviet infantry simply advanced straight toward it, the result could be costly. But if a direct fire gun forced that machine gun silent for several minutes, if engineers opened a path through the obstacles at the same time, if a tank covered the direction from which a German counterattack might come, and if infantry moved in before the position could recover, then a strongpoint capable of stopping an entire formation became a local problem that could be solved. And then the assault force moved on to the next problem. A bunker, a house, a section of trench, a crossroad, a bridge. Each objective could still be dangerous, but it was no longer being treated as part of one impossible war. That was the crucial change. The Red Army did not have to prove that the Königsberg defenses were weak. It only had to make it increasingly difficult for those defenses to concentrate their strength in the same place. Artillery helped isolate. Smoke and suppressive fire helped troops approach. Engineers opened routes. Armor dealt with hard positions. Infantry occupied and held the gaps that had been created. And when one of those gaps opened, its importance was not simply that Soviet troops had advanced another few hundred yards. A penetration could expose the flank of another position. It could cut a road German reserves needed to use. It could leave an intact fort increasingly unable to support the soldiers fighting beside it. That was the greater danger for the defenders. A fort might survive tremendous punishment as long as the enemy continued attacking its strongest phase. But if Soviet troops broke through somewhere nearby, hid behind it, and severed the route connecting that fort to the rest of the defense, then the question changed completely. The Red Army no longer had to ask, "How do we destroy this fort?" It could ask, "Do we actually need to destroy it right now?" A position might still contain soldiers. It might still have ammunition. It might still be capable of fighting. But if it had been isolated and could no longer interfere with the main Soviet advance, it could be contained, bypassed, or dealt with later. That is how a defensive system can begin losing its power without every part of it being physically destroyed. And this is why overwhelming Soviet firepower, impotent as it was, still does not fully explain why Königsberg collapsed so quickly. Firepower opened doors. Assault groups went through them. But the real question was what happened when those small penetrations began connecting behind the German defensive system. Because from that moment forward, the Red Army was no longer simply taking ground. It was beginning to cut Königsberg into pieces. A breach in a defensive line does not have to be wide to become dangerous. Sometimes it only has to appear in the right place. That was beginning to happen at Königsberg. When Soviet assault troops crossed a trench, seized a crossroad, or pushed through a gap between two strongpoints, the importance of that advance was not measured only by the few hundred yards of ground they had gained. What mattered was what that movement did to the positions around it. A strongpoint that had been secure from the front could suddenly find its flank exposed. An anti-tank gun perfectly positioned to cover one road could become far less useful if Soviet armor appeared from another direction. A German unit might still have ammunition, weapons, and men, yet discover that the road connecting it to its headquarters was now under enemy fire. This was where the character of the battle began to change. The Red Army was no longer simply pushing a German line backward. It was beginning to make that line lose its shape. Pressure from several directions created a very different problem from one massive attack against a single sector. If German reserves were sent north to contain one penetration, another threat could develop in the south. If commanders reinforced an important neighborhood, the roads behind that position might come under artillery fire, or be threatened by Soviet troops advancing somewhere else. And inside a devastated city, moving a formation from one sector to another was not as simple as sliding a marker across a map. Streets could be blocked by rubble. Bridges could be damaged. Road junctions could be under fire. Field telephone lines could be cut. Messengers might never arrive. A reserve only matters if it can reach the threatened position, for that position is lost. The more breaches appeared, the less time German commanders had to react. And the less time they had to react, the easier it became for new gaps to open. That is a dangerous cycle for any defensive system. Imagine a fort that has not yet been captured. Inside it, the defenders still have machine guns. They still have ammunition. The walls are still standing. Viewed by itself, the position may look perfectly capable of continuing the battle. But suppose Soviet infantry has already passed beside it. Suppose the road behind it has been cut. Suppose the neighboring position has gone silent. And suppose headquarters is no longer certain which unit controls the ground between them. That fort has now become something different. It is still dangerous. It can still kill. But its influence over the larger battle is beginning to shrink. That is the difference between a strong position and a strong defensive system. A strong point can fight alone. A system is strong only when its positions can support one another. When one sector is attacked, a neighboring sector must be able to provide fire. When a penetration opens, reserves must be able to counterattack. When ammunition runs low, supply vehicles must still be able to reach the front. When commanders order troops back to another line, there must still be another line to fall back to. At Königsberg, each of those conditions was becoming harder to preserve. That is why the early Soviet penetrations mattered far more than the distance gained on the map. Every penetration created another exposed flank. Every exposed flank created another position that had to be protected. Every additional position forced the German command to divide reserves that were already limited. And when defenders are forced to protect every direction, they become less able to concentrate strength at the place that matters most. Yet one possibility still remained. If Königsberg could preserve a meaningful connection to the west, the Germans might still hope to move men and supplies, withdraw part of the garrison, or at least create one direction toward which their remaining strength could be concentrated. That was why the route toward Samand and Pillau was becoming so important. It was more than a road. It was one of the last things preventing Königsberg from becoming nothing more than a collection of isolated pockets. and as Soviet advances moved closer to cutting that connection, the battle entered a more dangerous phase. Because a fortress divided into pieces can continue fighting, but a fortress divided into pieces, with no reliable way to connect those pieces again, soon faces an entirely different question. Not how long each individual position can survive, but whether Königsberg still exists as one fortress at all. Another contradiction was taking shape inside Königsberg. The more the city was destroyed, the harder it became to attack. But at the same time, the harder it became to defend as one coherent system. By the spring of 1945, large parts of Königsberg no longer resembled a normal city. Earlier bombing had already devastated much of the center. Then came artillery fire, ground combat, and new fires. Roofs disappeared. Walls collapsed into street. Windows became dark firing opening. Basements remained beneath buildings that had lost much of everything above them. For a soldier on the defensive, all of this could be useful. A pile of rubble might stop or channel a tank more effectively than a hastily built barricade. A basement could protect men from shell fragments. A hole through a wall could become a firing position invisible from the street. A burned-out building could still hide a machine gun. And in a neighborhood where visibility might end at the next intersection, a small group of defenders could force a much larger attacking force to move with extreme caution. That is one reason urban fighting can feel much slower than the distances on a map would suggest. 100 steps might take a very long time. A single building might have to be checked floor by floor. A doorway might be mined. A quiet window could hide a rifleman. An alley that appeared empty might lead directly into fire from the next block. But the same ruins that helped a German platoon survive inside one building could make the situation of the entire garrison worse. Rubble did not choose side. If a road was blocked, Soviet armor might be delayed. But German supply vehicles were delayed as well. If a collapsed building concealed the defenders from Soviet observation, it could also block the defenders' view of neighboring position. If shellfire cut field telephone line, headquarters might know that a unit was still fighting, without knowing exactly what ground it still controlled. In urban warfare, that quickly became a serious problem. A company could remain combat capable but receive no new orders. A reserve unit might be sent toward an intersection the enemy had already captured. An ammunition truck might turn back because the familiar street ahead was now filled with masonry, burned vehicles, and shell craters. A medical team might know that wounded men were waiting somewhere forward, but no longer know which route was safe enough to reach them. Each problem might appear small by itself, but fortresses do not always collapse because of one enormous failure. Sometimes they collapse because hundreds of smaller failures begin happening at the same time. A telephone that no longer works. A bridge that can no longer be crossed. A company arriving too late. An ammunition point that can no longer be reached. An officer who does not know that the position beside him has withdrawn. A unit still defending one building while the defensive line behind it has already changed. And for the individual soldier on the ground, the larger picture could become almost impossible to see. He knew the room he was holding, the street in front of him, the sound of artillery outside. Perhaps a messenger arrived with new orders. Perhaps no one came at all. A position could continue fighting with great determination while the entire area around it was being cut apart. That was part of what made Königsberg so deceptive for its defenders. At the human level, resistance could still feel very real. An assault was repulsed. A Soviet vehicle was knocked out. A building remained in German hands. Those small successes could create the impression that the defense itself was still holding together. But at a higher level, the connections between those successes were disappearing. The Red Army faced many of the same physical difficulties. Rubble restricted tanks. Smoke reduced visibility. Infantry could lose direction. A unit that moved too quickly could become separated from supporting guns or armor. and any building bypassed too carelessly could become a position from which German soldiers fired into the rear. So this was not a battlefield the Soviets could simply rush through because they possessed greater strength. They still had to move carefully. They still had to clear important strongpoints. They still had to preserve cooperation between infantry, engineers, armor, and supporting fire. But there was one critical difference. The Red Army was moving into the city from the outside. If one route became blocked, Soviet forces could attempt to open another, bring engineers forward, or shift the direction of the advance. The Germans were being compressed into an increasingly smaller space. Every lost road was more than an inconvenience. It was one less choice. Every neighborhood cut away from the next was more than a local setback. It brought Königsberg another step closer to becoming a collection of separate islands surrounded by rubble. And that leads to the larger problem. A ruined city can be an excellent place in which to fight to the last man. But fighting to the last man and preserving a functioning fortress are not the same thing. To keep Königsberg alive as a fortress, the Germans still needed some direction through which the pieces of the defense could remain connected to the outside world. They still needed the road west. And as that road began to close, the ruins that had helped the defenders survive would no longer be enough to save them. By this point, Königsberg was not completely dead. The defenses had been penetrated in several places. Different sectors were being separated from one another. Ruined streets were making movement, communication, and supply increasingly difficult. But there was still one direction the Germans could look toward with something resembling hope. West. Beyond Königsberg lay the Salmon Peninsula. And farther beyond it stood Pillau, the Baltic port that remained in German hands. If a meaningful corridor could be reopened from Königsberg toward Samland, it would not turn defeat into victory. But it could change the way the battle ended. Reinforcements might still attempt to move in. Part of the garrison might escape. Wounded men might be evacuated. Civilians might have another route toward the Baltic coast. And most importantly, from a military perspective, Königsberg would no longer be completely isolated. That made the western route far more than another road during the final hours in which the Soviet ring was tightening. It became a race against time. German troops inside Königsberg attempted to break outward. German forces in the Samland area tried to pressure the Soviet positions from the other direction. If those two efforts could meet, even briefly, a corridor might be created. On the map, the idea looked simple. Push from inside. Push from outside. Meet somewhere in between. The battlefield was anything but simple. Between Königsberg and the German forces to the west lay ground increasingly dominated by the Red Army. Soviet artillery could strike the roads German troops were forced to use. Soviet infantry was occupying key positions. Armor and anti-tank weapons could turn a narrow route into a killing ground. And any German force attempting to break out had to leave relatively protected positions and move into terrain where Soviet firepower could reach it more easily. It was a gamble. But by then, nearly every available choice was a gamble. Remaining inside meant accepting that the ring would continue to shrink. Breaking out meant moving into enemy fire and hoping a corridor could be opened before Soviet forces sealed it again. Plans were made. In places, German troops gained some ground. There were moments when the distance between forces inside the city and German formations farther west seemed to narrow. And this is where the battle briefly retained a genuine sense of uncertainty. Not because Königsberg was suddenly capable of defeating the Soviet armies surrounding it. That was no longer a realistic outcome. But because an open western corridor, even temporarily, might allow thousands of people to avoid being trapped inside the city. Part of the garrison might reach Samland and continue the fight there. And German commanders might preserve at least some of the operational freedom they were losing with every passing hour. But that possibility depended upon something the defenders could no longer control. Time. Every hour that passed gave the Red Army another opportunity to strengthen newly captured positions. Guns could be moved forward, Infantry could dig in. Roads could be brought under more effective fire. The gaps through which a breakout might pass became narrow, and a corridor did not merely have to be opened. It had to be held. Keeping a route open under the fire of an enemy with superior manpower, artillery, and the ability to bring fresh forces forward was a very different problem from simply forcing a temporary passage through it. In the end, the German efforts from Königsberg and the Samnon side failed to create a stable connection. Breakout attempts were stopped. Temporary openings were closed. The western route, which had represented freedom of action, increasingly passed beyond German control, and that may have mattered more than the loss of another fort or another neighborhood. Because when the road west disappeared, Königsberg did not simply lose a road. It lost the possibility of recovery. There was no longer an obvious direction into which forces could withdraw. No reliable corridor through which reinforcements could enter. No practical route along which isolated units could attempt to regroup into one coherent defensive force. The men inside could still fight. A building could still be defended. A bunker could still fire. A local counterattack might even recover part of a street. But all of those actions were now taking place inside a battlefield that was becoming almost completely closed. That was the decisive difference. Earlier German defeats could still be understood as withdrawals from one position toward another. Now, many withdrawals no longer led toward another functioning defensive line. They simply led deeper into a shrinking pocket. The rubble still protected soldiers. The walls still offered cover. The forts could still inflict casualties. But the road that might have connected all of those positions to the larger battlefield was disappearing. And when the western corridor could no longer be reopened, the Germans had lost more than an escape route. They had lost their last realistic opportunity to turn Königsberg back into a defensive system capable of recovering from its setbacks. From that point forward, the question was no longer simply how much farther the Red Army could advance. It was a much more dangerous question for the men still inside. How long can a fortress continue fighting when its commander can no longer connect the pieces that remain? A fortress does not have to run out of ammunition before it is defeated. It does not have to lose every wall. It does not even have to lose every soldier who is still willing to fight. Something else can disappear first. The ability to command. And during the final hours at Königsberg, that was becoming one of the most serious problems facing the German defense. Imagine a command post somewhere inside the shrinking fortress. The maps are still spread across the table. The officers are still there. Field telephones sit beside written orders. On paper, the command structure still exists. But a map is useful only when the marks on it still describe the battlefield outside. At Königsberg, the battlefield was changing faster than reliable information could move back to headquarters. A neighborhood reported in German hands might already have been penetrated. A road that had been usable only hours earlier might now be under Soviet fire. A unit ordered to counterattack might no longer have enough men to do it. A battalion still shown on the map as a coherent formation might, in reality, have been broken into several small groups fighting from separate buildings. The danger was not simply that information was missing. The greater danger was acting on information that was no longer true. A commander might send reserves toward a position that could no longer be reached. A supply column might be ordered onto a route that Soviet forces had already cut. A unit might be told to defend a flank that had effectively become the new front line. And while German orders struggled to catch up with the battle kept moving. This was where the small Soviet penetrations described earlier began producing consequences far greater than the ground they captured. When Red Army troops pushed between two defensive sectors, they did more than move a line on a map. They could cut telephone cables, seize a road junction, force messengers onto longer routes, bring a supply road under fire, prevent a reserve formation from reaching the sector where it was needed. Each of those actions made the Königsberg command a little less certain about what it actually controlled. And that created a remarkable contradiction. At the front, an individual German soldier might still feel that he had not been defeated. He still had his weapon. He still had comrades beside him. The basement he occupied had not been captured. Perhaps the last Soviet assault against his position had even been repulsed. But several streets behind him, another defensive line might already have disappeared. Farther back, the supply route might have been cut. And at headquarters, no one might be certain whether his position was still defending an important part of the line, or whether it had become a small island left behind by the battle. That is why the collapse of command and control rarely looks like one dramatic moment. There is no single switch that gets turned off. There is no exact minute when every defender suddenly stops receiving orders. Instead, the system gradually loses accuracy. Then it loses speed. Then it loses the ability to react. One order arrives late. Another never arrives at all. One unit misunderstands the situation. Another withdraws without the neighboring unit knowing. An artillery battery still has shells but no reliable picture of where friendly troops end and Soviet troops begin. A group of soldiers keeps holding a position because no order to leave has reached them. In a normal defensive line, many of these problems can be repaired. An officer can be sent forward to inspect the situation. A new telephone line can be laid. Reserves can be moved. The force can withdraw to another position and rebuild its connections. But Königsberg was running out of space in which to make those repairs. The road west was effectively closing. Defensive sectors were being compressed. Routes through the city were becoming increasingly dangerous. Ammunition dumps, aid station, and command posts were being pushed closer to the fighting. Wounded men accumulated inside a city from which evacuation was becoming increasingly difficult. Ammunition might still exist somewhere, but that meant little if the unit that needed it could no longer reach it. Reserves might still exist on an order of battle, but a reserve trapped behind a destroyed road or a lost neighborhood was no longer much of a reserve. That is the difference between possessing resources and retaining the ability to use them. And that gap was widening inside Königsberg. General Otto Lasch, commanding the fortress, was now confronting a reality that was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. He still had units that were fighting. Some fortifications had not been completely neutralized. There were still positions that would cost the Red Army lives to capture by direct assault. But the question was no longer whether those positions could fight. The question was what their continued fighting could still accomplish. There was no reliable breakout route to the west. There was no realistic prospect that a relief force powerful enough to reopen the battlefield would suddenly appear. There was little room left in which to rebuild the defensive system as a whole. And every additional hour of resistance increased casualties while reducing the choices still available. This is where a commander has to recognize the difference between two very different things: the ability to continue resisting, and the ability to change the outcome. The German defenders of Königsberg still possessed the first. The second was disappearing. And that may be the clearest sign that the fortress had reached its limit. Not when the last gun stopped firing. Not when the final fort was physically destroyed. But when the command structure could no longer turn the units still fighting into one force pursuing one achievable purpose. Königsberg still contained many centers of resistance, but it was becoming less and less like a single fortress. It was becoming a collection of separate battles, one inside a building, another around a street, another inside a bunker or fort, while the structure that once connected all of them was disappearing. And that leaves one final question. If many walls were still standing, if many soldiers still had weapons, if some positions could still resist, then what had the Red Army actually destroyed that made Königsberg impossible to save? By the final stage of the Battle for Königsberg, some walls were still standing. Some fortified positions were still capable of resistance. German soldiers still had weapons, ammunition, and the ability to fight if Soviet troops approached their positions. And that is precisely why the fall of Königsberg can be misunderstood. If we look only at the forts that remained intact, it is tempting to believe that the fortress itself had not yet truly been defeated. But wars do not always end when the final defensive structure is destroyed. Sometimes a system dies before its last individual parts stop functioning. That is what happened at Königsberg. So return to the question that has followed us from the beginning. How could a city protected by forts, trenches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, urban strongpoints, and tens of thousands of defenders collapse so rapidly during the final assault? There is no single answer. It was not simply because the Red Army had more men. It was not simply because the Soviets had more artillery. And it was certainly not because the old Königsberg forts had suddenly become useless. Each of those explanations contains part of the truth. But the real answer lies in the way those factors work together. Before the final Soviet assault had reached deep into the city, Königsberg was already being forced into increasing isolation. The space available for German maneuver had narrowed. The routes connecting the fortress with the wider battlefield had become more difficult to use. Then the Red Army concentrated artillery, aircraft, armor, and infantry against selected sectors instead of attempting to destroy every defensive position at once. Firepower created opening. Assault groups combining infantry, combat engineers, tanks, self-propelled guns, and supporting weapons exploited those openings. A fort could be bypassed. A strongpoint could be isolated. A road could be cut. And every penetration made it more difficult for the next German position to support the one beside it. That was the mechanism that changed the battle. Königsberg was not broken like a door shattered by one enormous blow. It was taken apart. One sector lost contact with another. One supply route became too dangerous to use. One reserve formation could no longer reach the place where it was needed. One command post lost contact with soldiers who were still fighting. One intact fort suddenly discovered that the Soviets no longer needed to attack its strongest face at all. Then came the failure to restore a reliable connection to the west. That was the piece that almost completed the picture. As long as Königsberg retained a meaningful link toward Samland and Pilar, there remained at least some possibility that part of the defensive system could be preserved. Men might move out. Reinforcements might attempt to move in. Separated formations might still hope to concentrate their strength in one direction. But once that possibility disappeared, the remaining defensive sectors increasingly had to fight like islands. And an island can fight for a long time, but it cannot support the island beside it. That is the distinction that matters. The forts did not have to be physically destroyed in order to become unable to save the city. They only had to stop functioning as parts of the same defensive system. A machine gun could still kill. A bunker could still delay an assault. A group of German soldiers could still repel a local Soviet attack. But if those local successes could not be turned into a larger counterattack, could not reopen supply routes, could not restore communication, and could not create a new coherent defensive line, then they could no longer change the outcome. That was the reality General Otto Lasch eventually had to confront. Continued resistance could still cost the Red Army more lives, but inflicting additional casualties was not the same thing as saving Königsberg. There was no longer a realistic path by which the city could recover as one functioning fortress. And during the final day of the assault, Lasch chose surrender. The decision enraged Hitler, who later condemned him in absentia. But orders issued far from the battlefield could not reverse what had already happened on the ground. An order to continue fighting could not reopen roads that had been cut. It could not reconnect units that had been separated. It could not create a relief force that did not exist. And it could not transform isolated forts back into one coordinated defensive network. That is the answer to the contradiction of Königsberg. The Red Army did not need to completely destroy every fort before the city could fall. It needed to destroy the system that made those forts matter. Isolation made Soviet concentration possible. Concentrated firepower created breaches. Those breaches allowed assault groups to move deeper. Those penetrations created fragmentation. Fragmentation reduced the German ability to maneuver, resupply, communicate, and counterattack. The loss of the western route removed the possibility of recovery. And finally, the command structure could no longer turn thousands of men who were still capable of fighting into a force capable of changing the result. That is why the final assault could end so quickly. Not because walls had become meaningless, but because modern warfare had revealed something deeper about what a fortress really is. A fortress does not exist only in concrete, brick, and steel. It exists in the connections between soldiers, weapons, roads, information, supplies, reserves, and command. As long as those connections remain intact, even an old fortification can remain a dangerous obstacle. Once those connections disappear, even walls that are still standing may do little more than protect the isolated men trapped behind them. Königsberg, in that sense, fell before its last fort did. The remaining positions could still fight, but they could no longer save the city.